Good morning again to another Snow Cone Diaries entries. It's October 1st, 2021. It's a Friday. And I wanted to spend a couple of minutes this morning talking through basic network topology in terms of how information gets across the globe right now, dovetailing essentially into a better understanding of what artificial intelligence is as we understand it, how it's related to intelligence that we typically associate with the human form and the human mind, and what that potentially says about the nature of the world that we live in. Okay? My background is in distributed computing and networking, specifically a scalable enterprise data systems and infrastructures. And what you see today in terms of the types of software that are being built and the types of machines that are being built and sort of the human to machine interface design and this whole idea of AI kind of having a life of its own. You think of Tesla and automated driving machines and so on. It's an extraordinary level of technology that perhaps the world has never seen. But at the same time, there's a way that it is constructed that I think is lost on most people. And so virtually everything in terms of innovation that we've seen, certainly around tech, has been based out of has come from the development of the computer, which came out of the 1950s. This Turing machine, which was sort of a theoretical computing model that in turn was given sort of a physical form. And then, slowly over time, we've developed, more powerful computing machines. I mean, like the machine that I'm on right now is in even 2005 would have been considered, a massive server type machine. And it's now in my desktop in my office. And it facilitates all sorts of things with computing power, but also what you have underneath all of this computing power. Okay? Moore's law, right? Doubling every 18 months or something like that in terms of computing power. What you have is you have this whole network infrastructure. And, this is the internet, right? It was created by DARPA to try and basically be able to run shit in the event that there was a nuclear problem, right? And that slowly evolved the machines, and then, there's redundancy built in and so on. But that whole network topology is constructed off of a layer. It's called an OSI model, where you have the physical layer, you have a data link layer, you have a network layer, then you have a transport layer, then you have a session layer, you have a presentation layer, and you have an application layer. And basically this model, without getting into detail about all the individual layers, is built in sort of a blockwise fashion, so that higher level logic is built on top of lower level logic. The same type of intellectual design, you could say, when writing was developed back in 3000 BCE, more or less, whether it's China or ancient Sumer or ancient Egypt, you have sort of a base set of symbols, and then based upon those symbols were originally hieroglyphs. They meant ideas. They were ideograms, basically. They became logograms, which were, sounds, and they became building blocks from which you could then construct and encode sentences and carry and store and persist information. All right, so let me say that again. You could then carry and store and persist information over time. And then now you have this sort of cascading effect of the buildup of knowledge and information that accelerates over time. And we basically now can digitize information and can store virtually unlimited amounts of it. But ultimately what we're encoding is information, whether information based on sound or an idea. That's what's happening when you write something down. It's being encoded, it's being stored somewhere for retrieval at some point. And the network topology facilitates the transmission of all that. So on the one hand, you have this massive buildup in the ability to store and persist information, right? And then on the other hand, you have this massive buildup of the ability to transmit that information. And then you have the ability to build applications that process, store, transmit all this information in near real time. Retrieval, transmission in near real time. This is how TikTok works. This is how FaceTime works. This is how Facebook works. This is how Instagram works. You have the ability to basically, go live and transmit information effectively to the entire planet from your living room. This video that you're seeing of me is a translation of what this physical room looks like. It's a set of information. It's encoded based on light and all sorts of things that are coming out of this camera. Stored locally and then transmitted everywhere. And so you have this foundational informational infrastructure, okay? And when you talk about computing, right, what you must understand is that everything is based on digital circuitry. So you have zeros and ones. Everything boils down to zeros and ones. And this is what we see with the I Ching, for example, where you have yin and yang. You have a dashed line and a straight line. A dashed line, boom, boom, and then you have the male, the firm and the yielding. Based upon these principles, trigrams are built. Based upon the trigrams, you build hexagrams until you have 64 hexagrams, and then you have a full description of, basically it's a state machine of the entire metaphysical description of the universe. Your place within the context of heaven and earth. This is the way that the system of the I Ching is constructed, based upon the same idea, the same principle. That you basically have the firm and the yielding. You have the male and the female. You have the on and the off. And from this, in sort of a very practical, provable engineering-based way, right? From this, a universe can be constructed, and this is part of where I'm ultimately headed with some of this. Okay. This sort of cosmogonic idea of, you have the male and the female, out of which, the Vesica Pisces and the universe sort of manifests, right? This sort of, that very, very old idea that we see pretty much everywhere is, then at some level it's a proven hypothesis in terms of the utility of the I Ching for thousands of years. If you haven't, it's a device that's consulted. It's like an oracle. You present it with a question, it gives you an answer based upon this metaphysical description, which is embedded in the document, right? From a computing standpoint, you have zeros and ones, and everything is built off that. And you're pushing instructions around and building certain things to visually display images, to move data around, whatever it is that the application is doing. Ultimately, on that digital circuitry board, it's a 0 and a 1. With quantum computing, they're trying to create an environment that allows for non-Boolean type logic. It can be in multiple states, which would expand computing power and potentially revolutionize computing, but ultimately it's a value. It's a value of 0 and 1. And that's what the entire information infrastructure is predicated upon. Okay? And based upon these basic, very simple principles and this infrastructure that we've put in for transmission of information effectively at the speed of light, and I've talked a little bit about this before, light information is, we can encode things and pull them up on the other side. That's exactly what's happening right now. So where we are from a computing and a tech standpoint right now, we're now starting to build things that start to behave, that start to look like us, behave like us. We can design a robot, right? I think Tesla's got a robot out that looks like the movie I, Robot, which may have had Will Smith in it. Looks very human-like, and you could build the human interface, the human interface design in such a way that it behaves, it appears like a human, and then you also have computing power underneath that, starts to behave and talk, make decisions like humans. All of a sudden, what's the difference? And this is a great fear. Elon Musk has suggested that this is one of the great fears, that AI is going to go out of control. The whole Matrix movie is built on this scenario that, The machine is taken over and is, utilizing humans in some, bastardized symbiotic relationship, right? And out of this, what we're finding, actually started a show last night with my wife. It was based on this massive multiplayer game. I think it's called Mythic Quest or something. It's very funny. And they build these virtual worlds based on this infrastructure that we talked about, this network infrastructure, this massive persistent data store capability now where you can store virtually infinite information and retrieve it in sub-millisecond type time. You can build these massive multiplayer games where they're virtual worlds. People spend days in these things at a time. My son played these games, these shoot 'em up games. I forget what it was, Call of Duty, I think it was. Dude, the graphics on these things are outrageous. It's like you're in a movie. You used to show a movie in 2 dimensions, and now you have the ability to immerse yourself in an adventure game where you do that for long enough, it starts to bleed into your reality in a way. People spend days on these things. And the next step, of course, is to put these sort of glasses on and sort of, and these fully immersed VR environments, which are starting to create too now, where people, can go in and paint stuff, where they can go in and, you can be in the shoot 'em up game, but, you feel things. They have these virtual reality machines where where you're driving cars, where it feels like you're driving cars, right? Like, the point that I'm making, ultimately, is the idea of creating a virtual world that appears real is not a hypothetical construct. Okay, it's happening. We're taking that tech, that idea, and we're manifesting it in the physical realm right now. And where do you think it's going to be in 50 years, in 100 years? Fast forward 500 years. So, so what's AI? First of all, you need to understand that artificial intelligence is not some wizard in the back that created something that has a life on its own. Okay, so you need to this is part of why I'm explaining the normalization of the data set down to zeros and ones. Okay, ultimately you're talking about information processing. That's what a Turing machine does. That's what all computing machines do. Every piece of computing power, it's got some inputs, pushes out some outputs. So this idea of AI that, look, Silicon Valley is really creative, and they got to come up with these new buzzwords, and they got to come up with these new things because you got to buy the new stuff. So you don't have AI? What do you mean you don't have AI? Well, you buy our stuff, then you have AI. That's great. Well, what does it do? Well, it gives me some reports and some alerts, and then makes some decisions. That's AI? I've been building software like that for 20 years. What's so special about your stuff? Well, it's more intelligent. It's more intelligent? Well, it depends on how you use it, as it turns out. There's a lot of these AI-based systems out there, and in some sense, there is a threshold that's passed, in the sense that where old systems would require manual intervention, systems that are being developed right now that have to be developed because of the amount of data that's being processed and analyzed and needs to be acted on in real time, you have to have the ability to inject the machine directly into the process and sort of take the place of the human. But we're doing that in all facets of industry right now. But when you're talking about networking and information processing, it's at a different scale. So you do have kind of the injection of software and a certain latitude and freedom that it is given today because we have to, because of the massive data sets. So it's not that the machines are taking over, but the machines are doing what we need the machines to do necessarily. The AI part of it is a little bit forward thinking, you might be able to say, but ultimately the logic has been coded by a human being based upon algorithms that have been designed by human beings, okay? that process data and that make decisions act on that data based upon input from and configuration from human beings. So like, I think Kasparov is the guy who actually speaks quite intelligently about this. He's one of the chess masters. He talks a little bit about AI and all this fear around AI right now. Everybody is walking around with machines, computers, laptops, the phones. Everyone's walking around with these devices that have almost unlimited access to information and almost relatively unlimited computing power, right? At least relative to where we were 10 years ago. This sort of symbiotic relationship between man and machine has already happened. It's everywhere. In your car, in your house, machines and automations everywhere. And we're directing it. We have control over it. And, there's this idea of, governments building systems to control us, and then sort of individual freedoms versus sociological. That's sort of a different type of debate that you can have. But generally speaking, facial recognition technology, scanning technology that I'm sure that the NSA and others are reading stuff over the pipe to try and protect the country. That's what they should be doing at some level, right? This is part of the world we live in, with this sort of massive data and set of information that's going around. Very Big Brother-esque, but that's the nature of the beast. That's why you have all these privacy laws that are coming out right now. There's GDPR. A couple of states in California and other ones in the states are starting to move in a similar direction. That's why these things are becoming important, because the tech is moving to a place where you got to consider certain things today that you didn't have to 10 or 20 years ago. The amount of information that your network provider has on you is astounding. Yes, they're trying to deliver a service to you, taking data sets, massaging it, trying to understand what you need, and then presenting something back to you that gives them the best chance to monetize their solution, or monetize the solution of their partners. That's what they're supposed to do. It's capitalist society, trying to make money. They've made an investment. But in so doing, they've grabbed all this information and they're creating AI basically to present you with stuff. This is where all the machine knows about you. The machine knows because they algorithms. So you reach a point where, from a systems perspective, where things get so sophisticated that they start to take on properties and characteristics that the original designers may or may not have intended, right? And that's just the natural byproduct of building sort of hierarchical layer systems, which is the way you have to build systems. And I'm mostly at the top of that stack. I do enough networking to be dangerous, but I'm mostly on the application and infrastructure support side. So I'm on the top of that stack. But that includes high availability, redundancy, performance, and security requirements that touch the entire network infrastructure and integrate with the entire network infrastructure. And all of that is required for us to run a business. All of that is required for us to, as a society, function, right? So, bringing things back a little bit, the idea that virtual realities could be created is not a foreign concept to us by any stretch of the imagination. Now, the unique and distinctive part about, from a philosophical perspective and an ontological perspective, the study of being, what is the nature of being? From that perspective, you have an organic structure that is given life. And then you have the senses through which they perceive life. Okay, so, and this, I'm going to refer back to some of the discussions that I've had, particularly about yoga and about thought and objective realism. The last couple of discussions that I had about, taking the leap that you are not the physical form, you are not the body, right? So I'm assuming you guys have prepared yourself and you've read, you've taken a look at some of that material. But that's the first major leap that you have to do to really get a much fuller picture of what's happening here. So in this particular case, there's biochemistry involved that is plugged directly into the virtual reality, right? So that's the That's the miracle part. That's the part that we don't necessarily completely understand. We don't know. We just don't. We don't know understand how it happens. But, and this is the key, we don't have to rely on some spiritual or divine intervention in order for the theoretical possibility that we live in a matrix-like holographic universe to be true. It just, there are certain things that we don't understand from a technology standpoint in terms of how the spirit gets into the body and then how it perseveres afterwards, and what the relationship is between the physical and the spiritual. Necessarily, we know that there's a connection. We know that there's an entry point and an exit point. We know that those entry and exit points are not necessarily just on life and death. That the system can be overridden, let's say. Whether it's lucid dreams, whether it's near-death experiences, we know that the system can be overridden. And certainly in advanced states of meditation, people leave their bodies all the time. So, and it's pretty prevalent. More and more people are talking about it. So the idea that we may be living in some sort of a simulation where it appears, because we're so plugged in and ingrained in this physical form into what it means to smell and to see and to hear and taste, and it feels so real to us, that the idea that it may not be quite, that its reality, or there a fundamentally different reality exists that is more real than it, in a very real sense, pardon the terrible use of language there, that idea seems foreign to us. It means they've done a really nice job, actually. Who designed the game, and how did we become biochemically engineered such that we could participate in and be a part of the game? I don't, those are really interesting questions that have typically fallen into theological domains over time. But what I'm suggesting is it need not be. We have a basic paradigm where these massive virtual reality systems can be constructed. We know that because from an engineering standpoint, we built them. So how much is missing? Well, the biochemical piece is missing in this sort of very unique structure of DNA, which serves as the basis for life on the planet. We'll get to that a little bit. I've written about that in Homo Mysticus. The mystery around that. It actually looks as if, and it looks a heck of a lot like the theoretical Turing machine designs. I talk a bunch about that in Homo Mysticus. And despite the fact that we can see pretty far back with the human genome in terms of the progression of life and whatnot, using a variety of techniques that are out of my domain of study necessarily, but there is some mystery relative to the fact of how DNA got here and how DNA itself evolved as a mechanism by which life could form. So, in a universe that we think is about 14 billion years old, what's possible, what isn't possible, what type of, virtual reality technology could be created, and is it possible that we are in a system that was designed by intelligent life? These questions start to be scientific questions. They're not theological or religious questions. They're scientific. They need to be scientific. They are scientific questions. We are somehow integrated directly into the system. This is what quantum mechanics is telling us. The system is somehow like, David Bohm and Graham Hiley call it the undivided whole. They had sort of a pilot wave theory that they used to explain what quantum mechanics tells us, and some of these strange ideas of non-locality and entanglement and wave-particle duality and some of these other properties that the fundamental fabric of existence exhibit, that are just not classical mechanical ideas. They're not objects in on a billiard table. And and so you get closer to the idea that somehow light and information and consciousness are integrally related concepts and ideas, and that they provide the underlying sort of fundamental archetypical framework of the universe that, or the physical universe. And yet this dimension, this sort of physical dimension of that's grounded in the five senses, and our five senses, and instruments that extend these things look further out or look very close down, right? It's all, we're looking at these types of this type of reality, this type of physical reality, and the attributes and characteristics that we attribute to this type of physical reality. There certainly is the possibility that there are other dimensions where these physical properties are not predominant, and they do not characterize that dimension in the same way that they do here. The ability to move between these areas of consciousness is almost baked into our being. This is we have the dream states and we have the waking states, right? The conscious and the unconscious mind. The ability to move between these states is somehow fundamental to us. It's part of it comes naturally to us. We survive based upon our ability, the sun and the moon and the cycles and sleep and waking. We survive based upon this sort of cycle through these different dimensional states of being or states of awareness. So somehow the two are married. And it's just not necessary for us to have to, resort to, the religious domain to look for explanations for some of these things. The science, the engineering is pretty darn close. Close enough where you could say, well, here's an amazing idea, right? So you guys know what Minecraft is? My kids play Minecraft. It's unbelievable what this thing does. You go in, it's a virtual reality game that allows you to create virtual reality. And you build worlds in this game, and parents are freaked out by it, which I think is sort of funny. I think it's amazing. I think kids play it all the time. But to talk to my wife, we have different approaches about whether or not these things are great for kids, and I probably lean a little bit too far on the other side anyway. But point being is that virtual reality, which facilitates the creation of virtual worlds, it's not a theoretical idea. It's not. So how far back does that construct, as above, so below, this sort of fractal geometric cascading reality that we know we're in at some level, how far up the food chain does it go? I mean, these are open questions, right? But these are scientific questions. These are not theological or religious questions. That's the point that I'm making. Starts with the fundamental premise that you are not this physical form, that you have a life force that enters when you're a child and leaves when you die, and that has a bridge to other worlds while you're here. And that we're fundamentally connected as a species, right? Which is some of the other stuff that we'll get into. But you start with that, and then you start with the idea of, well, what is tech? How is it constructed? What does artificial intelligence even mean? And how does that relate to what kind of world we're actually living in? And of course, the mechanics of it. This is the metaphysics, which is what I've really emphasized. And I'll get into more of this as I get more into sort of the theoretical framework that I've constructed, is what are the implications? What are the mechanical implications, right? How should you run your life, and how should we build a society based upon the knowledge of how things actually work, of what we're dealing with? What are things that we can move and evolve, and what are the constraints? What are the things we can't? What resources do we have plenty of? Which ones do we not? You know, Musk would have us live on Mars or something, or go, to go to another planet. Maybe, but like, feels like we could maybe do a better job here first. And that's really where a lot of the work ends up, is in sort of a practical, more grounded domain of, okay, so this is what we're living in. What does that mean? Day to day. What does that mean? What are the implications? And how do you kind of take that knowledge and integrate it into not only a better understanding of who you are, but what your relationship is to the world around you, both in the world of matter and the world of spirit. So AI isn't really what it's touted to be necessarily. Everybody's building AI software. Anything that's intelligent right now is artificial intelligence. It's like, okay, well, yeah, it's not, it takes some data and it makes some decisions. Okay, great, but like, just don't believe the hype. That doesn't mean that there's not advanced, rapid developments that are occurring, that are transforming the way that, we live and the way businesses are run. That's happening. And yeah, it's crossed a certain threshold now. Because you can have massive computers that do and analyze massive infinite data sets for, in near real time, and transmit that data across the world. Those are revolutionary developments. But there's a very symbiotic relationship between us and the AI. And I think as technology advances, that's going to, sort of continue to bleed into each other in terms of the distinction between man and machine. As I get into this a little bit more in Homo Mysticus. Ex Machina is the subtitle of that book. And then, as you can see in our physical realm, you can see this technology revolution taking place, and this symbiotic and synergistic relationship between man and tech, whether it's his car or planes or computers or whatever. It's ubiquitous, right? It's everywhere. You don't even know. There's computers in my refrigerator. You see, it's everywhere. You start to see the lines between human intelligence, biologically constructed intelligence, and artificial intelligence are starting to blur. And this is why people are so worried about AI, because AI is going to become us. This is the lines blurring is the what's causing the fear. And if you sit and you reflect on that, you can conceptually think about a super advanced technological system that has the capability to bioengineer virtual reality. It's not out of the realm of possibility. If you give us 1,000 years, you think we can figure it out? Build a world that seems so real that you wouldn't even know that there's another world. You're so immersed in it. Do you think that's really so far out of reach? So, yeah, there's a good chance we're living in some sort of technologically advanced virtual reality. That's really the long and short of it is. From my assessment anyway. From one engineer to whomever, if you've made it this far. Anyway, that's this morning's diary entry. Not sure what's up next, but everybody have a great day or evening, as the case may be. Peace.